InvestorIdeas.com podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of InvestorIdeas.com podcasts. In today's podcast, I'll be going over a few public company financial reports, the state of the legal cannabis industry in New York at the moment, as well as the cannabis pilot program in Switzerland. So first today, starting with Sundial Incorporated, trading on the NASDAQ as SNDL, who reported its financial and operational results for the first quarter ended March 31st of this year. Now, the results for the first quarter of 2023 also include the operating results of the Valens Company Incorporated, subsequent to the acquisition on January 17th, and the results of the first quarter of 2022 include 1 day of Alcanna Incorporated operations, subsequent to the acquisition closing on March 31st of 2022. And Sundial has also posted a supplemental investor presentation on its website, which can be found at sundial.com. I'm not going to be going into each of the specific financial details. You can find that in the links attached in the article, or again, go to sundial.com to find a more detailed financial release. But just looking at some of the commentary here, we're pleased to report progress towards a key milestone in our operative segments against the backdrop of expected seasonally moderate sales in our retail networks, said Zach George, Chief Executive Officer of Sundial. Now, the integration of Valens is proceeding with pace, and we are actively identifying new revenue streams and cost reduction opportunities. Now, the first quarter was impacted by a number of one-time items, including $13.5 million to replenish liquor inventory, following the seasonal holiday draw in the fourth quarter of 2022, $2.7 million in severance and restructuring costs, $17.5 million to stabilize Valens and bring overdue accounts payable up to date. And we expect additional restructuring charges to impact the second quarter and the results of our team's hard work to become clear in late 2023. Now, we are focused on improving all aspects of our business with the objective of generating strong free cash flow. And the relocation of all cannabis processing activities to our Kelowna complex will drive improved capacity utilization, and we are aggressively reducing our exposure to higher cost cultivation as we seek low cost producer status in a relevant product categories. Now, in our retail segments, we are carving a path to higher margins and are excited about the recent launch of our data service programs and the potential for improved consumer engagement through the new e-commerce and loyalty capabilities. And we also look forward to updating investors on our intended dividend of Nova shares and events related to our Sunstream portfolio in the coming weeks. 2023 is shaping up to be another transformational year for our company. So obviously, if you've been paying attention to the stock, had a little bit of a downtrade today and over the last week as well. And this is, again, something that goes pretty standard for a lot of these cannabis companies leading up to their financial results, as we always see a slight sell-off. Obviously, there has been some exceptions, but I think most of the time people shouldn't be too surprised by what these results are showing, which is that at the end of the day, there still are a lot of difficulties when it comes to generating basically free cash flow and moving away from just a high expenditure model, which unfortunately with the acquisition of Valens as well as Alcanna, that was an inevitability. I think most people were expecting a lot of these numbers to come in the way they did. It is showing, though, that they are at least beginning to stabilize where they need to be, and it should lead into a fairly productive 2023 for Sundial. Definitely a company worth paying attention to over the next year, just because, again, of sort of the broadness of their portfolio now. Sundial was doing really well in sort of bulk product categories before. They still have sort of continued to do well within that market. Hopefully now with Valens, they can sort of increase some of their Cannabis 2.0 type of products. That's really what Valens has built out over the last couple of years, is really focusing on the extracts market. And they have done fairly well there, but hopefully, again, the combination will lead to some interesting products and hopefully put them in a little bit of a better position in some of those higher cost product categories. And that's really something that, again, from a large scale perspective, so Sundial, I would say, is decent sized right now. There are a few, obviously, cannabis producers who are still larger than them. But for where they are in their sort of size range, they would be one of the bigger companies to actually really succeed well within the extracts category. What we've seen so far is it's been a lot of niche small producer companies who have done really well within those sort of high cost product categories. So when you're looking at extracts, when you're looking at even some of the premium bud, and the products that are selling at a much higher price point. A lot of the success stories we've seen so far are still from very niche and small scale operations, and it's just because the reality is we've seen over and over again producing really high quality bud at scale is quite difficult. You need sort of small boutique operations, and there's been, again, a lot of this has been repeated and sort of proven over and over again. Even when you're looking at MSOs in the US, a lot of these companies now are working with small boutique companies within each state and are sort of building a house of brands versus trying to build one brand that can go throughout multiple states. Edibles companies have done pretty well at this, and I think that's in part of the industry that's a little bit more consistent. Just because of how you can develop your edible products, you can make them a little bit more accessible and scalable than with extracts. There's a difficulty, and even with just the dried flower, there are some difficulties. But as I said, definitely a company worth paying attention to. And if you're looking at sort of where their finances are, a good company to compare them to right now, just looking at sort of the other side. Obviously, Sundial's focused much more on production and actually selling the product themselves. And then there's the other company, Fire and Flower Holdings Corporation, who also announced its financial and operational results for the fiscal quarter of 2023, and the first quarter ended March 31st of this year. And Fire and Flower focusing much more on the retail side. So by looking at both of those financial results in more details, you will get a good idea at least of the Canadian landscape at the moment. Those are two companies that have a pretty broad reach and are very spread out throughout Canada. So they're a good gauge to kind of pay attention to what's going on. So from Fire and Flower Holdings Corporation, our first quarter of 2023 is a clear demonstration of our continued discipline on delivering positive improvements in our overall operational results. Once again, we saw same-store sales and gross margin growth. And as we look towards 2023 as a transformational year, the company is focused on our core retail business, supported by High Fire, which enables us to deliver higher gross margin percentages and the best available products to our customers, shared Stephen Trudell, the Chief Executive Officer of Fire and Flower. Now, our continued innovation and long-term focus is demonstrated through the recent launch of the Sparks Marketplace mobile app that allows customers to shop with ease and has already produced significantly large transaction amounts that are rather than in-person transactions. And consolidation opportunities in the industry that are fully accretive to our business are a key priority as we look to long-term goal of achieving 10% market share. Now, while keeping our eye on long-term visions, our team are working diligently to generate savings and SG&A expenses and simplifying our business and building value in core assets, concluded Mr. Trudell. So, I've talked a lot about Fire and Flower and, again, how they've really been ahead of the game when it comes to Canadian retail, implementing technology. Again, talking there about their Sparks Marketplace mobile app. Seems to be doing quite well for them, and I would say the High Fire system and the Sparks Perks program have been kind of a proven success within the Canadian retail landscape. There has been companies even in the US who have been looking to work with Fire and Flower at utilizing that High Fire and Sparks Perks program and eventually implementing that into some of the US retail areas. And I do think that at the end of the day, that side, sort of the technology aspect of retail, is something where we still haven't seen kind of where it's going to end up. There's still a lot to be desired there. There's still a lot of limitations based around the regulatory framework, either in Canada or in each individual state in the US. Again, we've seen some sort of broad changes over the last year. Paying attention to Twitter, allowing for advertising, I think opens up a lot more doors for cannabis companies in the US and in Canada. And eventually, I think you're going to see more implementation of technology like Fire and Flower has already done here, but obviously in a bit of a broader sense, because eventually the regulations will either loosen up or become more clear, and it will allow for companies like Fire and Flower using their High Fire and their Sparks program to kind of innovate and expand and start doing more advertising and start utilizing hopefully more social media companies and more online companies. Again, right now, Twitter is kind of the only one that's really come out and actually somewhat endorsed the cannabis industry. When you're looking at other programs, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, etc., everything else is pretty hard-lined on showing or really overly advertising for cannabis products. But it does just take one to sort of start the trend. So I would think that eventually you'll start to see those things change. And hopefully a company, like I said, a Fire and Flower Holdings Corporation is a good company to pay attention to as far as where cannabis is within the technology landscape and where it needs to be or what needs to change over time. But again, the only reason I picked Fire and Flower Holdings and Sundial today is just if you're looking at Canadian cannabis, specifically those two companies, and sort of paying attention to their financial results is a good benchmark to pay attention to what's going on in Canadian retail overall. Again, both of them have a very broad scope, and you can obviously compare them to a few of the other companies who have released their financial results either this week or last week, and there's still a few more that are going to be coming out later in May. So obviously there will be a lot to compare to. I don't think overall you're going to see any huge movement on any of their stocks, just because in general there's not really any surprises coming out with these financials, and in general as well, people aren't really expecting anything crazy to be happening over the next few months. I know that there's been a lot of talk about the Safe Banking Act in the US, but that doesn't really seem like it's actually going to happen. And you can listen to pretty much all of my past podcasts to hear me talk about safe banking. There's been lots of different interviews where we've talked about sort of the legitimacy of this. When is it going to come through? What are the expectations? And over again, you've seen that there's a lot of hype, and then there's a lot of stalling, and then the whole thing sort of falls apart. And this has happened several times in the past. So as much as, many people within the government who are attached to this bill seem very confident about it. They have seemed confident about it many times in the past. It always seems to come down to overreaching and then getting pushed back and then having the whole thing sort of dropped away for another several months, if not a year. So it seems like that's probably something we can expect again this year. But if it does go through, that would be a huge boom for the U.S. market. And I do think you would also see then a little bit of a trickle effect into the Canadian market as well, because there are many Canadian companies who have sort of been waiting for access points to get into the U.S. market and expand. And unfortunately, there hasn't really been that opportunity. But safe banking could do that, but it doesn't seem likely. So moving on, a recent news story from CNBC. Again, the link is attached in the article at investorideas.com. I would highly recommend checking it out. They do a much more in-depth analysis of the whole New York cannabis market and sort of some of the difficulties, but just basically sort of the rough focus was on the rollout of legal weed within the tri-state area and how it's been called slow and cumbersome, allowing for the proliferation of gray market storefronts and businesses to sell marijuana without going through the regulatory process. In New York, for example, the mayor's office estimates that the city is home to 1,400 illicit businesses selling marijuana without a license. Those legitimate businesses face stiff competition from shops that are not following the rules, said Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg during the February 7th news conference. It's time for the operation of unlicensed cannabis dispensaries to end. Now, at the same time, state officials are trying to right the historical wrongs brought about by the decades-long war on drugs, and New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey all have social equity components in their recreational marijuana programs, focusing on granting licensed applicants with previous marijuana-related criminal convictions. Every cannabis company should be focusing on hiring people who have had previous cannabis charges and people who have come from communities that have been impacted by the war on cannabis, said social equity applicant Tahir Johnson, who was about to open Simply Pure Trenton in New Jersey's capital city. And again, you can listen to some of our past interviews with different New York operators, specifically Cosmarte, who is doing the Con Bud, where he's an ex-con himself, and specifically hiring people who have been incarcerated or have had different convictions related to nonviolent drug offenses. So I do think that there's a lot of that. But on the other side, last week another news article discussed how the New York Cannabis Insider will be hosting a full day of Problems and Solutions Summit at the Crowne Plaza Hotel in Albany on May 18th. You can learn more and buy tickets if you look at the link attached in the article, or if you look up this whole New York Cannabis Insider Summit at the Crowne Plaza. I'm sure you'll be able to find it quite easily. But really, this goes into a much more detailed discussion of what is happening within the New York landscape and some of the issues that are occurring there. So a group of conditional adult use retail dispensary licensees, or the CORD, have documented in a letter an alarming and unacceptable lack of communication and transparency among state cannabis regulators. Now, the group of 7 CORD licensees along with the Long Island Cord Coalition and several others, have signed anonymously, sent the letter late last Tuesday night to the Office of Cannabis Management, the Cannabis Control Board, the Dormitory Authority of the State of New York, or the DASNY, and well as a representative from Governor Kathy Hochul's office. And the letter was also sent to the New York Cannabis Insider. Now, the bulk of the group's ire is directed towards DASNY and the structure of its social equity cannabis investment fund, which is supposed to be providing funding for the identification, leasing, and build-outs of 150 cord sites across the state. Now, as New York Cannabis Insider has documented repeatedly, the fund, which is overseen by the DASNY and managed by Social Equity Impact Ventures, has failed to raise any money since its inception. In the CORD program, we are consigned to a process that is monopolized by the DASNY and the fund by which the financial information service providers and access to real estate, the authors wrote. Now, the CORD licensees cite as grievances the DASNY's obscure and opaque lease agreements, exorbitantly priced build-outs for CORD locations with no ability by the licensees to negotiate, delayed or non-existent site approvals, and more. It appears as though we are once again asked to participate in a market that is fundamentally inequitable and counteractive to the purpose of the very initiative the government launched, the authors wrote. Now, at the end of the letter, the group asked for a meeting within the next 14 days between the CORD licensees, representatives, and the key representatives of the OCM, the DASNY, and the the CCB to address the issues expeditiously. As our licensees at the forefront of this industry, we fully expect you to address these concerns and propose a path forward so that the original promises made by the state can be upheld. It's the state's responsibility to uphold its commitment to social equity initiatives and promises made to participants in the CORD program. In response to the letter, the DASNY spokesperson Jeffrey Gordon told New York Cannabis Insider that the agency and the OCM are committed to providing licensees with the opportunity to succeed through mentorship and support, and we look forward to meeting with them to address the concerns that they have. So, if you've been paying attention, has been sort of a back and forth discussion within the New York cannabis retail space for a while now. This was something that was discussed even before the retail in New York was launched. Basically, a lot of people were saying that this looks like there's going to be a lot of problems early on. They were saying that there's difficulties when it comes to the entire licensing process, that there's difficulties when it comes to getting leases, getting approvals. And then a lot of people, including the interview with Cosmarte, did discuss the fact that basically we have a similar type of landscape here and a similar type of problem to what happened in California and what has happened in other markets as well, which is basically a slow program that gets onboarded kind of haphazardly, and it allows for a lot of these illicit businesses to pop up in sort of the great midterm. So basically, because there was delays in people's licenses getting approved, because there was delays in people getting lease approvals and getting into their stores, all these different sort of bureaucratic oversights that basically slowed down the success of this industry right from the get-go and wasn't really prepared to onboard this market quickly and effectively, allowed for a lot of these illicit businesses to basically pop up while things were still being developed and while things were still, mid-discussion. And now that they're there, it's very difficult to get rid of them. And that's kind of the same situation within California. Is once you start to have these illicit businesses pop up in certain areas, it's really difficult to actually completely eliminate them or get them out of the area, just because you can seize assets and you can close them multiple times, but they'll kind of just keep popping up again. And unfortunately, because they don't have to deal with all of the licensing fees, the operational costs, and all these extra expenses that all of the legal businesses do have to deal with, they can kind of just eat the cost of having their products seized or having their storefront closed for a few days, just because the rest of it is just going to be pure profit, cash on hand for them. And they're always able to price compete with these legal businesses because of all these differences in operational costs. And people kind of discussed this early on. They said, is New York going to have these problems? It seems like we're going to have these problems. And then, of course, it does seem that those problems have occurred. So it'll be interesting to see, to pay attention to that meeting on May 18th, to see how that goes, what comes out of that, if there is any changes to how licensing gets dealt with within the New York landscape. I wouldn't be overly optimistic about it. It does seem like this is just the problem everywhere. Is there's some people who have a better understanding and have done more research and I guess are just more mentally invested in the success of cannabis within their state. Again, some states have found it's a very smooth process. It's been quite efficient, quite effective. They haven't really had any issues with licensing. They haven't really had issues with sort of onboarding these cannabis programs. They haven't had a bunch of illicit shops show up. They've been very strategic and sort of straightforward with how the whole process is going to be. And then there's been other states, they tend to be more populous states, tend to have more bureaucracy and therefore have more issues because of sort of the delay that a lot of that bureaucratic oversight creates. And I do think that, I think everybody wants New York to be a successful market because that's in the financial sector. New York is attached to the entire world of finance in the U.S., and so to see a successful cannabis retail landscape there would be a good endorsement for eventually allowing for safe banking, would be a good endorsement for federal decriminalization, and I think that you need to have specifically New York City really succeed in order for people to see that this is a legitimate sort of aspect that can be implemented anywhere in the world, or at least anywhere in the U.S. California is, I guess, a little bit too open and maybe hippie-ish seeming of a market for people to really take it seriously as far as something that could be replicated in other parts of the country, even though now basically every state has cannabis programs. New York, and specifically the tri-state area, just because of their population density, their attachment to the finance industry, and sort of being known as an international hub in the U.S., I think is very important, and hopefully we will see some of these issues get addressed, but there's probably going to be a lot of continued discussions around how this gets dealt with, and I'm sure that they're going to have, unfortunately, because what we've seen in every market, once you get those illicit businesses in, it's really hard to get them out. So I do think that they're going to have a big issue with that. That's going to continue at least for the next couple of years, just because there doesn't seem to be any good proven strategy of how to deal with that once it's occurred. It's kind of, you have to stop it from occurring in the first place, and then it's easy to manage. But if you allow for too much of these gray market businesses to pop up alongside your legal businesses, you end up with a very skewed and sort of confusing legal landscape to play with. And we've seen this again in California, we've seen this in parts of Canada as well, in other states, and we've also seen this get avoided in other markets as well. So hopefully New York can eventually deal with this, because again, if you're paying attention to just the success overall of the cannabis industry, you really want New York to be a successful market, as sort of a proof of concept of that type of metropolitan city can also adapt into the retail cannabis landscape. And lastly, in other news, the Swiss city of Bern will be joining Basel, Zurich, Lausanne, and Geneva to legally distribute cannabis later this year. Now, the Bernese pilot trial for the regulated sales of cannabis in pharmacies, dubbed the Safer Cannabis Research in Pharmacies Randomized Control Trial, or SCRIPT, has been authorized by the Swiss Federal Office of Public Health and the Cantonal Commission of Ethics and the Ethics Commission of Northwestern and Central Switzerland. Now, the 3-year study, which will be lasting from October of this year to April of 2026 and be monitored by the universities of Bern and Lucerne, will aim to assess the health of social effects of selling cannabis in strictly regulated nonprofit pharmacies. Now, it will be carried out in the cities of Bern, Biel, and Lucerne, and should start probably in the fall. And the experiment plans to recruit 1,000 participants, including approximately 600 in the federal city. Now, only people who have already used cannabis for recreational purposes or who are at least 18 years old will be able to participate in the study, and furthermore, only half of the participants will be allowed to buy cannabis products for the first 6 months. Now, according to the Reto Oer, head of SCRIPT, study of the University of Bern, the objective of the study is to test the health and social effects of selling cannabis in strictly regulated non-profit pharmacies. Study participants will only be able to obtain cannabis products which have been produced specifically for the study in selected pharmacies, and revenues generated by the pharmacies will only cover their expenses with the study being run on a non-profit basis. Now, SCRIPT will test regulations that aim for strict control of supply and demand while allowing risk reduction measures. And this means no advertising will be allowed with the products, and they will be sold in neutral and standardized packaging. Now, Rita Ora explains that these elements should make the products less attractive, especially for young people, and we know the effectiveness of these measures from the field of smoking prevention. The aim of our study is therefore not to simply legalization of cannabis, but also consists in testing risk reduction measures to address the problems caused by a ban and the illicit market while controlling supply and demand for these products. Now, the study should provide data for possible future regulation of cannabis at the federal level aimed at promoting public health and social security. So, the Swiss pilot program, I do think, will be an important thing for basically the EU cannabis market, just like there's the pilot program going on in France as well. I do think that it's weird to see how much the EU has really shifted their perspective on cannabis over the last decade or so, being as these were countries that used to be, I would say, a little bit more socially lenient towards it, and now have shifted to being, I'd say, much more hardline against the dangers and the risks of cannabis, treating it much more, I don't know, I guess, much more fear-based than even the U.S., which is interesting. Obviously, though, at the same time, in the EU, there aren't as many people actually in jail or arrested for cannabis-related offenses. I talked a little while ago about how there was the man who was convicted and publicly executed in Singapore for trying to import 2 pounds of weed, and he didn't actually even touch the weed himself, but needless to say, he was executed for his crimes. EU obviously isn't that extreme. There's still way more people in the US and Canada who are still in jail and serving time for cannabis-related offenses than in the EU. But that being said, there is still, it seems like there's a lot of specific needs that need to be met for EU marketplaces to really open up for cannabis retail. And hopefully studies like this Swiss one, again, the one going on in France, some of the information coming out of Germany will kind of prove the concept that these can be brought back into society, that you can have legal cannabis industries built around the pharmaceutical space that already exists, and there aren't really a lot of issues with it. It is interesting that, they're focusing on things, worrying about the branding towards children and all these things, and how they talk about the effectiveness of this within the smoking industry. But as we've seen within the US and Canada and other parts of the world, the smoking industry will just pivot. They've moved to vaporizer devices. They've even moved to, non-nicotine and non-tobacco vaporizer devices. They're just basically selling you oil mixed with some sort of flavor that you just vaporize. And those companies have proven to be wildly successful, even though the oil, when it's vaporized at that high heat, does cause issues for the lungs. It seems like at the end of the day, I do find personally that idea of we're going to keep things away from kids is just such a delusional concept. It seems to be coming from a place where of people who do not understand the minds of anyone who's younger than them, and also seem to be living in just abject denial of the reality that as much as we've tried to ban these products, just like as much as we've tried to stop alcohol use for children as well, none of these plans really work. It just means that, teenagers, younger people just find sketchier sources to get those products. And at the end of the day, there is no real avoiding any of these products getting into the hands of people. That's what we've shown with criminalizing any drug all over the planet, is it doesn't actually really work. When you actually have laws trying to prevent people from using these drugs, all it does is raise the price of that on the street, and then also forces people to interact with more criminal organizations to gain access to those products. It doesn't change the fact that people are going to use them or not. And if anything, it creates sort of an increase on the overall demand of those products and makes them sometimes more tantalizing to young people. Whereas if they were given just normal access or normal education around these substances, if it became kind of mundane and boring, that's probably the best option for how to keep this from being an abused substance within younger demographics. But something that's never going to be really openly endorsed by any government agency, I don't expect. Obviously, in Portugal, they have kind of been the leaders in that by allowing for pretty much the legalization of every substance and realizing that safe access is kind of the best option you can hope for. And again, there's lots of different studies out there that are supporting that idea that basically just having safe access is the best option, even within the EU and the UN. They have been discussing ideas around basically decriminalizing everything, of trying to allow for a different model of basically correction instead of trying to punish people and criminalize them for doing something that it seems is an inevitability. We should be instead trying to support and help these people either overcome their addictions or at least get access to safe products and taper down their addictions. There's a lot of products out there that can help with this. Legalizing of psychedelics seems to be a beneficial thing. And again, you can go back to some of the past podcasts where I did discuss the differences when it comes to death and health surrounding cannabis versus pretty much every other substance out there, even compared to sugar. Cannabis is miles and miles ahead. In fact, again, if you try to look up on Google, how many people a year die from cannabis, all you find out is how many people a year are actually saved from having access to medical cannabis, just because that means they're not going to be using traditional painkillers like opiate-based painkillers, and that will probably save some of their lives. So there is no version of cannabis being released into the public that starts causing a bunch of harm. There has been a bunch of articles circulating within the last month about cannabis being related to schizophrenia. There's a lot of different weird debates there because schizophrenia really, obviously people would say it's a very real disease that does affect 1% of the population. On the other hand, we could also say that schizophrenia kind of fits into the same category of anxiety, in that many people, by answering just a few simple questions, especially if you've just been smoking a bunch of weed or taking a bunch of psychedelics on a regular basis, could easily get diagnosed with schizophrenia, even though they don't actually have it at an extreme level, just because pretty much comes down to having thoughts that are anti-conformity or thoughts that are against the regular narrative of life. And the reality is that many people, when they either smoke weed or enjoy psychedelics, do start looking at the reality we live in and realizing there's a lot of strangeness going on. It is strange in general that we have regulations surrounding plants that grow in nature. That seems somewhat psychotic if you just think about it from the standard of this is a literal weed that can just grow extremely abundantly in nature, and you don't really need to do anything to the process of it other than dry it to utilize it. You dry it and smoke it. You can grow it basically everywhere on the planet. We've been around and exposed to this plant for thousands of years. There's lots of evidence that this is one of our earliest drugs we've been sort of exposed to, and yet at the same time it's an illegal substance that's treated dangerously. Just looking at that alone can make you feel a little crazy sometimes. And then suddenly if you go to a psychiatrist or a different medical institution and start talking about that, you could actually get diagnosed with schizophrenia, at least in a mild sense, and then you could be given different pharmaceutical drugs and been told to stop taking cannabis because it's overstimulating your schizophrenia, etc. But the reality is that there's many studies that prove that cannabis exposure doesn't really change the number of people who are schizophrenic. It simply is the fact that if you are likely to be schizophrenic and you smoke weed or take psychedelics, that could just make it more obvious that that is a problem for you. But again, if you look into sort of the entire medical history of schizophrenia, there's a lot of dark realities to that. It gets into the same sort of concept of how women in the past were lobotomized for having hysteria when they wanted to leave their husbands. There's a lot of people who get categorized with schizophrenia who maybe aren't as schizophrenic or dangerous as people might imply, just as cannabis is not as dangerous and deadly as it is often perceived to be from both the medical and regulatory, governments of the world. So something to consider. And that's all for today's podcast. Enjoy the rest of your day. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated's CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.